Westuhal min Freon and welcome to another video. There have been a couple of requests to make videos about certain things, and I decided to make them into one slightly longer video that will be also more or less interactive, in which I will be asking you, my dear viewers, some questions, and I can't wait for your answers. Now, those three requests are all involving Tolkien. The first one was how I started actually to be a Tolkien fanatic, the origins of European lore as a Tolkien enthusiast. The second request was to ask you, my viewers, actually, to provide me with your stories and what you read the first, how you started reading Tolkien, or how you got into fantasy in general. And the third request was, I think, a question that every Tolkien YouTuber or fantasy YouTuber in general is asked quite often, and that is how to start reading Tolkien. That's obviously the easiest one, at least for me. I think the answer is quite clear there, although we have to distinguish Tolkien as a novelist and a poet, and Tolkien as a philologist, a scholar. Because not only did he write his fantasy stories about Arda, such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but also he published many books on Old English literature and Old English, the language, and also he translated old works such as Beowulf or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I consider all of them to be a must-read for everybody. However, there are, of course, some people who are not that much interested in linguistics or Old English literature. I am. I've got actually a degree in Old English literature, and I've published some books on the matter, and also I've attempted some translations from Old English into modern English and my own mother tongue, Czech language. So for me, it really, one does not exist without the other. And for full enjoyment of anything that Tolkien wrote, it is, I think, imperative to be acquainted both with his fiction and with his non-fiction books. However, if you are only interested in getting into his fantasy stories, it is obvious that you should start with The Hobbit. Not only because it is, as far as the publication chronology, it's the first one that was published, of course, in 1937. But it is also the easiest one to read, the quickest one to read, the shortest one. It is basically a fairy story. It is a fairy tale. It is a children's book. Tolkien wrote it for his own children, and then he, of course, published it. And it's the purest form of escapism and the purest form of secondary world fantasy that you can ever imagine, of course. You can get through The Hobbit in a matter of 2 days, really, if you take your time and enjoy the reading, a couple days. But other than that, it's just really the choice to start with. Of course, I would then continue with The Lord of the Rings. I would recommend not to be too hasty while reading The Lord of the Rings, as it is with any escapist literature. Just enjoy it. Immerse yourself in the story. Try to let it soak in the journey of Frodo Baggins and his companions to defeat the evil of Mordor. And then, of course, once you've read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, which can be found in each and every copy, either the collected edition of The Lord of the Rings or in just The Return of the King, I would get into the Silmarillion. And there, beware, of course, but many people know that. Those people who have read the Silmarillion, you know, it's not a book that you would just read. It's a book that you have to study. And that comes from the mouth of a man who's read and reread Silmarillion more than a dozen times. Consider it to be not a novel, not a fantasy novel, but a chronicle slash a religious book, because the way you have to approach the Silmarillion is very similar to the way you approach any religious book, such as the Bible. There are many names, and it's very chronicle-like. It's not as narrative as The Lord of the Rings. It's very episodic, but Christopher Tolkien managed to edit Tolkien's notes and texts in a way that it really provides you with a comprehensive story as well. So it's much harder, much more difficult to read than The Hobbit or the Silmarillion, and you will be glad for index and glossary because there are indeed many names, many bloodlines and houses that you, if you so wish, will have to remember and memorize, or at least jot down somewhere, write somewhere down, so you can remember who the heck are we talking about now. And then, of course, if you are interested, there have been many more publications published posthumously by Tolkien's son Christopher that are expanding upon the stories of Arda, such as the Unfinished Tales, or the, let's say, extended versions of some of the stories from the Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales, such as the Children of Húrin, or Beren and Luthien, the Fall of Gondolin, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, once you've read all these books, you might be interested in some of the publications that are provided with notes, extensive notes by Tolkien's son Christopher, but of course the history of Middle-earth as well, which is an extensive collection of volumes that trace the development of Tolkien's stories from the very beginning to the very end of Tolkien's life. And it starts with the first stories, the first notes, the first attempts in stories about Arda. And they are very much different from the final result that we have got published nowadays. It really started very similarly to, Tolkien attempting to make myths and legends for England, as I have talked about many times in my previous videos. So still, you can find more connection with real legends from the primary world's history and myths than from the final result, which is, of course, absolutely and 100% separated from the primary world. Then, of course, Tolkien, not only did he write stories connected with Middle-earth and Arda, but he also wrote many other works of art, such as The Letters of Father Christmas, which I do recommend as a Christmas story, a Christmas book. He also wrote that for his children in the form of letters, which he was sending them, quote unquote, each and every Christmas, as if they were from Father Christmas himself. I do recommend Leave by Nibble, which is just a short story, absolutely not connected with Middle-earth or Arda or anything like that, but I do have to admit that it is one of the best short stories I've ever read in my entire life. You can get yourself The Adventures of Tom Bombadil and other books that you can easily find either on the internet or in bookstores. And then, of course, if you are more interested in his academic life and what he published while teaching at Oxford, I would recommend a collection of his essays called The Monsters and the Critics and Other Essays, which not only contains an essay on Beowulf and translating Beowulf, but also on fairy stories, and that I would say is his best essay, or my favorite, at least, my favorite of his essays ever written, in which he in length describes what fairy stories are and his relationships with fairy stories, and the fact that they are not only for children, but maybe more so for adults. And that is why I love it so much, because I 100% and absolutely agree. I would then recommend his translation for those of you who are really then like, who have read all these things that I've already mentioned, but are also interested not only in Tolkien, but in fantasy and history and mythology and legends in general. And that is his translation of Beowulf. There have been many translations of Beowulf, translated from Old English, and I would say that his is one of the best ones there are. There are, of course, many quality translations. I think that the best one ever is by Seamus Heaney. I think that's also the most famous and the most popular one. And now, this is really my recommendation as far as where to start and where to continue reading Tolkien. And now my story. Well, I have actually already talked about it in some of my videos. It's very interesting, and that is why I don't really reject adaptations, but I'm very picky, and I've got very strict opinions about adaptations. It was actually, I was 6 or 7, I think, years old when I read Chuck Dixon's adaptation of The Hobbit into a graphic novel form. So that's when I encountered Tolkien for the first time. And I was so immersed in the story and so fascinated by the story and by the art that I immediately had to ask my parents for the Hobbit novel, which I read in nearly one sitting, if I can remember correctly. And then it went on, and it actually went on, I think, in a very similar way that my recommendation was. There was The Hobbit, there was The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, The Unfinished Tales, and then his more academic work as I started getting into linguistics and the history of languages and myths and legends. And it all escalated when I went to university and started studying actually Old English. I got completely immersed in Tolkien's academic life and his work. And through him, I got into the academic publications of C.S. Lewis and other old Oxford dons. So that's my story. Not that original, really, as many other people did. Usually, people read The Hobbit when they are little kids, and then they continue. So that's it. That's my story. And the last part, my friends, let me know in the comments down below what your Tolkien history is. I'm very much interested in that. And that will be all for today. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your recommendations for the videos. Thank you, my viewers. Thank you, my subscribers. Thank you, my channel members. And that will be all. Now, Marie.